Let's get started with part 1 of the series, Slavery. Is slavery morally reprehensible? Do people in any industrialized society in the world still deem slavery acceptable? The Bible is pretty vocal about slavery. What follows are 3 Old Testament passages that describe rules regarding slaves. First, in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44 through 46. Now, most rational people will agree that slavery is morally reprehensible. Unfortunately, the Bible ordains permanent slavery as an acceptable practice. I say permanent because these verses claim that the Israelites can own their slaves, taken from conquered locals, and all of their offspring in perpetuity, sort of like land, estates, or any other inheritable possession. Now read Exodus chapter 21, verses 1 through 6. These verses discuss the parameters of keeping Hebrew slaves, how long you can keep them, the terms of their service, their dismissal, and should they decide not to leave after their allotted time, how to permanently mark them to indicate your permanent ownership of them. Take a look at verses 20 through 21 of the same chapter. These verses tell the Israelites how to handle the physical beating of slaves. In a nutshell, when beating a slave, if he or she dies immediately, the person responsible should be punished. However, if the slave that was beaten stays alive for a day or two before they expire, then the slave owner that beat the slave is not guilty, since the slave, quote unquote, is his property. It is amazing what the human body and spirit can endure, and testing those limits is something that God seems to be okay with. Well, just so long as the slave doesn't die immediately. You might be saying to yourself, now wait just a minute. That was the Old Testament. Doesn't the New Testament teach us to treat others as we would be treated? Well, yes, it does. But even if the New Testament were to denounce slavery as evil, this would not change the fact that the God of the Old Testament is the same God of the New Testament. And he is a God that says he does not change. It's unfortunate that out of all the times that God has contradicted himself in the Bible, he chose continuity concerning slavery. Let's see exactly what he has to say about the issue in the New Testament. In Philemon 8 through 18, Paul returned a runaway slave to his master, petitioning on his behalf that he not be treated too severely because the slave Onesimus was a brother in Christ after all. He also admonished slaves to serve their masters well in Ephesians 6:5. If all early American Christians were to have followed Paul's example in this situation, slaves in the Underground Railroad would have had a hard time depending on a Christian's compassion and love for their fellow man, because God, through his inspired apostle, would require that all runaway slaves be returned to their masters. So if you're one of those Christians hanging your hat on the fact that we're no longer under the Old Testament, and therefore we can sweep all those ugly things that went on back then under the rug, you'll have a hard time doing that with the issue of slavery, since the New Testament does not condemn this practice. In fact, it clearly commands the slave-master relationship.